both on our Synod's Hunger and Justice Committee, and but she is a member at Calvary Lutheran in Grand Forks, and my son and family were members there at Calvary from '92 until 2005. So a couple of connections. But it's been a delight for me to get to know her and to experience her passion and all. I'm just going to read the part that was underneath the picture. It says, Phyllis Johnson, a former University of North Dakota Vice President for Research and Economic Development, as well as a United States Department of Agriculture Senior Executive and Scientist, mixes her strong stance on climate change with religion when she visits Lutheran churches in eastern North Dakota. And she is Vice President of the Eastern North Dakota Synod. So when Bishop Terry Brandt waves his whatever, she has to snap to. As the Vice President, we're delighted to have you here, Phyllis.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'll say just another word or two about why I think I'm qualified to talk about this. I have a PhD in chemistry from UND, and when I finished grad school, I went to work at the USDA's Human Nutrition Research Center in Grand Forks. And I spent nearly 20 years there doing research studies on human nutrient requirements. I even did experiments with people, not just with lab rats. And then in 1991, I moved into a senior executive position with USDA, first on the West Coast, and then eventually I became the director of USDA's largest ag research center. You might have heard of the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center just outside of Washington. It's the most comprehensive research center around food and agriculture in the country. So I learned a lot about food production and agriculture and all the science that impacts it. You know, and when you move from the lab bench to being an executive, you know, you're no longer a specialist. You have to know a little bit about everything. And eventually I did come back to UND, moved home to Grand Forks, and spent time there as the VP for research. But when I retired again from UND, and shortly after that I became the Synod Vice President, it just seemed like all these things I had done in my life sort of came together. And so I started speaking about climate change and food production and global population growth, which are all interrelated. And I'm sure I could talk to you for hours and hours, and of course we don't have that much time. So what I'm going to do is try to, you know, focus in on one piece of this for about 20 minutes and then leave time for some questions. But we are going to talk about saving money on the planet at the same time, and why we should do it because we are Christians. So we're going to start at the beginning, the very beginning, in chapter 1 of Genesis. After God has created human beings, God says, in the translation we're most familiar with, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And those words, subdue and dominion, are ones that we have heard since we were little kids first learning this story. But the interesting thing is, the meaning of the Hebrew word is really not quite like that. I think this translation probably goes back to the time of the King James Bible. Because what the Hebrew really means is hold the earth gently in your hand. And I always when I think of that, I think of, finding a baby bird, or one time my grandson and I found some baby bunnies whose mother had died, and you're very gentle. And that's really how we're supposed to take care of the earth. But we haven't done such a good job of that, have we? And one of the ways that we haven't done such a good job relates to climate change. And there are many, many, many lines of evidence for climate change, and I'm assuming because you're here, you probably generally accept that those are true. We could spend 2 hours talking about just why climate change is real, and you should believe it. But I think this is interesting because if you see the white line across the middle of this graph, this shows atmospheric carbon dioxide, which is one of the principal greenhouse gases. For 650,000 years, atmospheric carbon dioxide never went above the level of that white line. And you can see that about the time of the Industrial Revolution, it started going up. And by 1950, we were definitely above that line, and it's going practically straight up. And so our climate is changing. It's changing rapidly. I can certainly remember when I was a child, the kinds of expectations we had about the weather were a little bit different than we have now. Even in our lifetimes, there's noticeable change. And we don't know exactly how climate change is going to affect food production in every instance. But we do know that, for one thing, that a hotter and, in many places, drier world is going to have a big effect. Just look at the southern part of the U.S. The red and orange areas, there's a huge negative effect of climate change on food production. And so you think of the produce that we get from Arizona or Florida in the winter, or even all the livestock that are raised in Texas, it doesn't look so good. Here in North Dakota, we're kind of going to be in a sweet spot.
We have a blind guy here. If you could explain some of your pictures. Alan back here.
Okay.
Explain.
Yeah, so this is a map that shows how agricultural yields are going to be affected by climate change. And up north here, as it warms, our yields are going to tend to get better. But in hot areas like the southern U.S. and most of Africa and southern Asia, things are not going to be good. It's going to be a lot harder to produce food because when crops and even animals get hot, they don't do as well. I'm going to try to keep the scientific data to a minimum here, but I think this is an interesting graph because this is about the yield decline in wheat, soybeans, and corn as a result of high temperatures. And if the temperature is just above 86, there's very little effect on wheat and maybe a 5% decline in the yield for soybean and corns for 1 day of temperatures over 86. But when the temperature is above 97, these bars on the right, the effects are huge. We're looking at a 25% reduction in wheat yield and a 50% reduction in corn yields for every single day that the temperature is over 97. So it's going to be more and more problematic for a lot of places that are currently producing these crops, not just in the U.S., but around the world, to get good yields without some of the things that we're hoping that we'll be able to do through science and biotechnology. And I think there's reason to be optimistic, but there's no guarantees. Besides a warming world, there are a lot of predictions that water shortages are going to be acute in many places, and that there will be wars fought over water. On a very small scale, if you've ever spent much time in California, you know, Northern California and Southern California have a lot of disputes about water. And the people in California and the people in Colorado, where the Colorado River starts, have their disputes about how that water from that river is used. And you can see that the U.S. Is one of the highest users of water per capita in the world. Much of Africa uses very little water per capita, same for India and China. And, you know, to a large degree, it's because they haven't got as much. It's also because many of those economies are less developed. And we just kind of take it for granted. So that's another challenge to food production if you haven't got enough water. Even now, where there's irrigated agriculture, aquifers are being depleted faster than they're being recharged. And so in Nebraska and Kansas, where people are irrigating from the Oglala aquifer, they're pumping water out faster than it's going back in. And someday those chickens will come home to roost. Livestock are also vulnerable to heat stress. I never knew that a cow could get heat stroke. But when animals are really hot, they find it hard to stay healthy. And so the production of meat, the eggs that chickens lay, milk production by dairy cows all goes down if animals are too hot. And so that's another challenge that we're going to have. And yet we know, we all know these verses from Matthew 25, that we are called to feed the hungry as well as to care for the sick and so forth. This is something that we just do because we're Christians. But to complicate all of this, the United Nations is projecting that by 2050, we're going to have another 2 billion people on the planet to feed. There's 3 projections here. If we had population growth at the high rate, we'd have an increase of even more than 2 billion. We'd be up to 10.6 billion. Right now we're at about 7.3 or 7.4. The low prediction shows population growth kind of leveling off, which could do for a number of reasons, including people not having enough to eat. But right now we're on this middle line at about 7.3 billion people in the world, and the population is continuing to grow. If you think about it, it's not very long until 2050. A child that's born today is likely to have children of its own by 2050. And so this is something that's going to have a big effect on our children and our grandchildren because they're going to be living in that world that's hot and crowded. I think it's interesting that in Luther's large catechism, in his explanation to the Lord's Prayer, he talks about, when you pray for daily bread, you're praying for all the things that are necessary in order to have and enjoy daily bread. And he talks about, praying for the farmers and the fields and the entire land. But he also talks about this petition, meaning that we are praying for everything that works against having enough food. So in a way, when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we're praying that these forces that will interfere with food production will not come to pass. But just to talk about food production, every time a tractor goes across the field to plant or to harvest, there are greenhouse gas emissions. And all of those greenhouse gas emissions, as we know, are contributing to climate change. And there are more greenhouse gas emissions after harvest, because the harvest goes perhaps to a processing plant and then to the supermarket. And then we drive usually to the supermarket to get that food. And so at every step of the way, we're creating atmospheric emissions. And yet, 40% of the food in the United States is wasted. I forgot to bring my stock of limb celery this morning. I have one in my refrigerator. And, you know, we don't have to waste things like that, because even limb celery works really well in soup. There are a lot of ways that we can not waste food, but it's too easy not to see what's in the back of the fridge until it is green and furry, or to pick up a takeout container because restaurants serve you too much food. Half of those containers get left at the restaurant. People stand up to go and get their jacket on and they forget to take it home. And an awful lot of the others come home and go in the fridge until whatever was left over dries up and then you throw it away. It doesn't make any sense. And then, when all this stuff goes in the landfill, there's more greenhouse gas emissions. There is so much methane that comes from landfills that in big cities, it's being tapped as a source of fuel to generate heat and electricity.
In Fargo.
Yeah. So food waste accounts for 8% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions that are caused by humans. You know, if somebody said you could cut greenhouse gas emissions by, 5% or more really easy, you might think that they were smoking something. But actually, food waste, and so much of it is consumer waste, not all of it, but a lot of it is something that we can do something about. A couple of years ago, an organization called Green America came up with a long list of things to do to reduce climate change. And their first couple of things are things that we as individuals can't do a lot about. Refrigerant management. There's still a lot of Freon in the atmosphere, even though we're not putting it in our refrigerators anymore. Wind turbines. And certainly in North Dakota, there have been public policy debates about, how many turbines there should be and where they should be. But as an individual, there isn't a lot you can do to, get more wind turbines out there. But the number 3 thing on our list is to reduce food waste. And that's something that every single one of us can do. There's an organization called Save the Food that you can find online. They have this nifty little calculator, and you can slide that button along to whatever the size of your family is. And so if you have a family of 4, you can save $124 a month by paying attention to not wasting food. That's real money. That's enough to make a difference, I think, for just about everybody. And of course, if you have a bigger family, it's even more significant. So I think this is something that we need to think about. And there are all kinds of suggestions on the website for this Save the Food. And you may have even seen billboards. I see them in Grand Forks and here in Fargo from time to time, pointing out that food does nobody any good if it's wasted. And if you waste that food, of course, all those atmospheric emissions were for nothing. You're creating bad for no good reason. In Fargo here, there's actually a group that's been promoting the use of what they call ugly food. sometimes people think, well, I don't want to buy that forked carrot at the farmer's market. It looks funny. Or that misshapen potato. And, it ends up in a dumpster somewhere. Well, it all tastes good. And even bruised apples can make great applesauce. We all understand if you buy overripe bananas, you go home and make banana bread. Just because an apple has a brown spot on it doesn't mean that you can't use it for food. Maybe you don't want to eat it out of hand, but you can do other things with it. I got to tell you that besides eating your leftovers, you got to think about your Lolos. This is what my dad used to call leftovers. And we all know we sometimes have those. And some people get bored if they have to eat the same thing 3 days in a row. But I think there is a good reason to do this, because all of these things that we do to reduce food waste is a way of caring for our neighbor. Some of those neighbors are not yet born. But if we're concerned about caring for our world and concerned about intergenerational justice and what happens to the children of the future, we need to think about not wasting food. This is the easiest thing we can do to deal with climate change. So I want to conclude with one of my favorite verses in 1 John. Little children, let us love not in word or speech, but in truth and action. And I think what this means is, don't just stand around wringing your hands because something bad is happening. Get up and do something. And this is something that we can all do, and I think we're all called to try to do these things, because this is really going to make a difference for the world. And it's going to save you money. Why wouldn't you want to do it? So, questions?
Some people get confused about weather and climate. And they look at the weather. Yeah, and it's cold outside. And question whether or not there's.
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you.
Okay. Weather, the difference between weather and climate. And some people are confused because we had a cold winter. And we're talking about climate.
You're exactly right. People get confused about the difference between weather and climate. Weather is what we see on any given day. Climate is really kind of what you expect over the long term. And that means, over a period of years. And if you look at temperature averages and other things, we can see that our climate has changed. I mean, just since I was a young woman gardening, we've moved from the cold part of gardening zone 3 into zone 4, which means we can grow a whole lot more stuff, because there's not a lot of things that like our really cold winters. But overall, our winters we may have more snow sometimes than we'd like, but we don't regularly have those 40 below periods like we did when I was growing up. And that's because there is a change in the climate. The change in the intensity of big storms, like the hurricanes that we've seen, the one that hit Houston, for instance. There's pretty good scientific evidence that those storms are becoming more severe because of climate change. Yes?
So you're working with the ELCA, with Woody and a bunch of other great leaders. Are you reaching out to other denominations? Recently, some of us visited at a mosque, and they have similar goals to take care of the earth. So are you aware of any way that we're reaching out as the ELCA and the Synod to other spiritual communities, get all hands on deck? To me, it's kind of like fighting a flood. If you're not doing something about it, you're just worrying about it.
That's right. The Eastern North Dakota Synod does have a very good relationship with other faith communities. In fact, when Bishop Brandt comes back from the Conference of Bishops, he often says the other bishops are surprised how well we get along with the Catholics even. We have not made any formal overtures to other denominations about this particular topic, but we do have many full communion partners that we work with, and you know, for my part, I'm willing to talk to anybody that will listen to me. So if you know an Episcopalian or a Catholic or a Methodist or whatever, and they're interested in this, you know, we need to work together. Woody?
Yeah, first of all, just in the Lutheran Fold, we work with Lutheran World Relief and the Lutheran World Federation. The Lutheran World Federation is in 61 different countries. But also, out of Geneva, Switzerland, there's a group called Action by Churches Together. They're one of our partners. We also work with Church World Service. When we have a crop walk in the fall, that's something that Church World Service does. And there's also an organization called Bread for the World, where we can advocate and talk to our Congress people and so forth in terms. So we have those partners.
That's right. There's those really big partners out there. And in addition to advocacy via Bread for the World, the ELCA also has an advocacy office in Washington. And you can follow them on Facebook because they actually watch what kind of legislation is being introduced and develop positions on it and go to the Hill and talk to our members of Congress. A couple of years ago, I was at the ELCA Hunger Gathering in DC, and we spent an entire day on the Hill lobbying our members of Congress regarding things in the Farm Bill and other things that were important to us. So our church does do advocacy. It'd be really cool if somehow we got organized in a way that we could do advocacy in Bismarck. You know, all us shy Norwegians, sometimes people are reluctant to speak up, but it really does make a difference. Yes?
You were talking about how everybody can reduce food waste, and another thing that we can all do is make better choices in what we eat.
Mm-hmm.
Could you address that a little bit, like dietary choices in impacting the environment?
Okay, question is about dietary choices and the impact on the environment. There are people who advocate that we should all become vegetarian or nearly so. I think as time passes, meat is going to become more and more expensive in many places, partly because in some parts of the world, like China, where there's a growing middle class, as people move into that middle class, they want to eat more meat, just like we do. And there certainly is concern about the environmental impact of CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, feedlots, if you will, or big hog operations. On the other hand, there's a lot of land in the West that's rangeland that isn't good for anything but grazing, and so eating grass-fed beef is a little different than eating beef from a feedlot. I did read a paper a number of years ago that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a pretty prestigious journal, that modeled a range of scenarios for feeding the world without deforestation. Because if you're going to have this huge increase in population, and we haven't got that much more tillable land available, Some people think, well, we just cut down the forest. And that has other kinds of environmental impact because forests absorb carbon dioxide and store it away. So deforestation is not a good thing. Anyway, that paper calculated that, if everybody in the world ate a Western diet, we had just a very small chance of being able to feed the world. And if we all became vegetarians, lacto-ovo vegetarians, so we could still have milk and eggs, then the possibility to feed everybody was about 90% without deforestation. But to really be 100% sure that we were going to be able to feed everyone in the world, we'd all have to become vegans. And I think that's kind of a stretch for most of us. One other interesting thing is that there have been people who have looked at the climate impact of buying produce at a farmer's market and buying produce that's been shipped in, from a long distance. And if you drive to the farmer's market and just buy a couple of tomatoes and a cucumber, the atmospheric emissions impact of those vegetables is greater than if you buy the stuff that's been trucked in from California, because that truck carries thousands and thousands of tomatoes or cucumbers or whatever it is. So that's not to say we shouldn't eat locally, but we all know that one of the things that we should do is try to drive less, plan our trips so that we're not making a lot of trips to the same part of town multiple times a day, which is
buy a whole lot of vegetables.
yeah,
Big trunk full.
my husband likes to go to the grocery store every day. And that's really not the best plan. Better to make a list, go once a week, plan what you're going to buy,
Unless
plan
you
what
ride
your
your
menus
bike.
are going to be, and then eat
Unless
it.
you're on your bike, yeah.
Yeah.
How does extreme packaging fit in with all this?
How does extreme packaging fit in with all this? Well, a lot of packaging, of course, is plastic, which is made from fossil fuels. Even if we could eliminate the need for petroleum products for transportation, we would still need some petroleum products to serve as feedstock for making all kinds of synthetic materials, including the plastics that we all encounter every day and a lot of the fibers that are in our clothes. But the thing about extreme packaging is that, we put our garbage out on the curb and they come and pick it up every week. And then we don't think about it. But it's still on the planet. It doesn't go away. And Great Britain has realized this, in a big way, because that's not a very big island. And they don't have all the space we have. And so they have passed a law against unnecessary packaging of any kind. Whether you're buying a new razor or a game or you're buying something in the supermarket. Because they know there's nowhere for that garbage to go.
So you mentioned the legislature, and this last year, there were some people in Fargo thinking about maybe banning, the use of plastic bags at the grocery stores, or at least looking at best practices in like Hawaii or Oregon that have already done some of these things. And the legislature said that cities don't have that power. But that said, that doesn't mean we still can't do it. Because they can't tell us that we have to use plastic bags. So again, it's I think an option for us to just be thoughtful about, how many do we need? I actually take one once in a while just because we need it for cat litter. But, those are some choices that the legislature can't take away. And if we do something about it ourselves, there's demand. And then we can change the law later down the line, possibly. But I think that, just by having the legislator say we can't do something, we should maybe look at it as a challenge for, yeah, we can.
Yeah, we can all use reusable bags. That's a simple thing to do that reduces waste. If you do use plastic bags, for goodness sakes, recycle them. It's interesting about plastic bag bans, and I'm sure this was not what was in the mind of the legislature, because they just don't want to hear about anything that's bad for the oil industry, and we use oil to make plastic. But there are places that have had bans on plastic grocery bags, which are very, very lightweight plastic. And of course we use them for a lot of other things. Some people use them when they walk their dog, to clean up after them, or you package other kinds of things in them. But in some places where plastic grocery bags have been banned, the sale of other plastic bags, like small trash bags, has gone up, and that's heavier weight plastic, so it can actually be a bigger problem. But I've gotten to the point where, if I go to Lowe's or something, I'll just say, no, I don't want a bag. I'm going to take this stuff out of the car. I don't need a bag to put it in for 5 minutes. And usually people are pretty good about that. Yes?
Well, I think the other thing about plastic bags is there's other things that we could make plastic bags out of, like hemp. But we've decided that we can't grow hemp. And I think, again, change our minds a little bit about what our products are made of, and it's a choice that we also can make at the same time.
That's right. And hemp is not the only thing. You can make plastic out of cornstarch and potato starch and a lot of other things. When I was working at USDA, we had a real initiative on the use of bio-based products, and a lot of that is made from the waste parts of agricultural crops. You can even buy bio-based submarine paint if you happen to need it. But right now, those bio-based products tend to be a lot more expensive. And so they haven't reached the market. And part of it is we just have to demand that stuff. We had a scientist at Beltsville who patented a way to make plastic out of waste chicken feathers. And places that have big poultry production, we used to burn that stuff, burn the feathers or bury them, and now they're actually worth something. And you can make biodegradable plastic. So part of it is our attitude, and we need to tell retailers what we want.
You talked earlier about increase in production as we go north and as the temperature increases. Do you know what percentage that increases in yield contributed to that?
I don't know, what the percentage increase in yields is going to be. Certainly, if you think back to that map I showed, it looks pretty good for North Dakota because we're going to be able to grow things. I mean, 50 years ago, you really couldn't grow much corn in North Dakota, and now we can. And that's a combination of climate change and corn breeding, different varieties. On the other hand, I think it wouldn't be surprising if it gets too warm in North Dakota to grow canola, because that's a cold weather crop and it's very sensitive to heat shatter, dropping the seeds before harvest if it gets too hot. So we're going to be able to grow a lot of things, probably including fruits and vegetables, for a much longer period of the year than we have been able to, or that we can currently. And it's hard to know exactly, how big that change is going to be. The other thing is, of course, scientists are working on all kinds of things that will create heat tolerance and drought tolerance in crops, as well as flooding tolerance. I'm beginning to think the farmers up by Grafton are wishing they could grow rice, because if you drive, it's probably better now than it was a week or so ago when I was up that way, but up along I-29, it still was like a lake on both sides. It's time to be getting out and doing work in the fields. So I think there is a lot of possibilities from new methods of biotechnology, which really do not pose a risk to consumers, despite what some people try to tell you. And that's going to make a difference too in what people can grow. And it's going to be very important for people in Africa and India to be able to feed themselves.
How should we respond to the latest UN study about diversity and that sort of thing? How should we respond to the latest UN information that came out on biodiversity and climate change?
The latest
it's
UN
kind of dire.
study on biodiversity and climate change. Yeah, there's a lot of species of plants and animals that are in danger because of climate change. We've seen a lot of whales washing up dead on the west coast, and it's thought that some of that is related to rising ocean temperatures. It's going to make a difference for, probably native plants in a lot of places. And I think it just means it's more urgent than ever that we pay attention to doing something about climate change. We may be able to preserve examples of some of those plants and animals in arboreta and zoos and things like that, but that's not the same as having them out in the world doing whatever they do in the ecosystem. And sometimes you don't realize how important a species is until it disappears from an ecosystem. It looks like we're out of time. Thank you so much.
Woody, I wonder if you or Mike could just share a little bit about the Care for Creation group at St. John. And so there's a meeting later this month, right, on the 28th?
Yeah, we've approached some of the young people in our congregation and asked for their ideas first and said to the young people, hey, you kids are so creative. We're starting with you before we're going to the adults. So we're getting feedback from them. And Jeremy, our youth director, said the kids got excited about this and they want to talk amongst themselves. So they're doing some things. But we're going to be coming, whether you call it listening posts or whatever, and contacting a lot of you others, the adults in our congregation, in order to give us ideas.
So through the summer, we are thinking, usually we don't have adult forums, but maybe it would be nice to have some guest speakers like Phyllis over the summertime for people that are willing to listen after the single service. And to, as Phyllis said, put some action to the words. And so plan some events that we can show that we're making a difference. And I think it'll do some good. That's what the kids' ideas seem to be, at least the few that we heard right off the bat.
Right. Phyllis, it's obvious that you have expertise in many different fields. I mean, we can have people come in and they show us one little piece of the pie. But your knowledge of having worked in all the areas you have, it's delightful to give us that context in terms of what you shared.
Well, thank you for having me. I love talking about this stuff.
And Pastor Eric said she's going to come back and give a sermon in the fall.